Hey everyone, it's Allie, and I want to talk about our Pillar of the Cage God attribute stacking Gemling Legionnaire some more. Today is going to be the first of many updates for this build, and what we're going to talk about today is a minor change to our pass tree along with what kind of gear you'd want to look for this build. What I want to mention before we go any further is that there will be a build guide that I'm slowly working on for everything related to the pre-Hand and Wisdom action setup. There'll be a link for this in the description below, which is going to go over a lot of the information that we talk about here today, along with a lot more other information. And while this is currently a work in progress, the majority of the content is still there, and I'll be finishing up over the next few days for everyone to be able to follow along. What I didn't necessarily talk about too much in the leveling guide, which I want to go over a little bit more here, is how exactly this build is going to be structured. There's two variants of the build, and we're currently playing the super budget variant. This build, in my opinion, doesn't really start until you get yourself Hand of Wisdom in action, which is a pair of gloves that pretty much hypercharge this build to becoming, well, kind of broken. The thing about these gloves is they're pretty expensive, and almost everyone keeps trying to tell me that you need these gloves to be able to play this build and that this build is super expensive. And well, here we are playing a budget version of it, pretty much having no issues. What I want to do with this build is do what we're currently doing of talking about the budget setup for you to be able to follow along and play with me, because if I just immediately swap to the HoWA version, I can tell you most people wouldn't be able to follow, and I'm not the kind of content creator who's just going to tell you, figure it out on your own. I'd rather put myself in the trenches and play on a super budget version myself to validate and make sure that all this works for everyone to be able to follow along so we can all have fun, especially given there's a lot of new players. So with that in mind, what we're going to talk about today is the kind of gear that you want to find and upgrade yourself with to be able to get to tier 15 maps, to then put yourself in a position where you can reasonably farm the money required to get yourself the gloves. Before we do that though, I do want to very briefly talk about the passive tree, as we made a small optimization to it that I feel like is something worth mentioning to everyone. What we ended up doing was changing the pathing over to beef. We completely got rid of the blade catcher nodes, as these were just not very good, and just found it's better to just path down the slant and pick up beef this way. The other thing I'd recommend for you to do, and you should only do this once again to endgame, if you're still leveling, don't change this, as this is still worth it, is to drop brute strength. Once we get to endgame and start getting ourselves some better gear, this just really isn't a good source of damage anymore, and all these points are just kind of whatever. So once you get to maybe tier 2, tier 3 waystones, respec out of all this, and instead, we are just immediately going to go over to the right and beeline all the way up over here to acrobatics. We're not going to take acrobatics, but instead we're going to take enhanced reflexes, proficiency, and falcon technique. The mobile legs link in the description below will have the passive tree updated with this, and I'd highly recommend for you to make the swap over, as this is just going to give you a lot more attack speed and a lot more DPS, while all of these travel nodes are really good in my opinion. What I want to mention about attributes really quickly is what your current endgame goals are going to be. Ideally, you're going to want to get yourself to about 400 strength as a minimum, and then from there, you should start working on picking up dexterity on your passive tree and on your gear until you get yourself to anywhere between 200-300 dexterity. This is going to give you a lot of attack speed and make your single target damage be substantially higher, while making your clear feel even better, as you really notice the attack speed in Stormwave. And then past that, you're just simply going to keep scaling strength from there. Ideally, you'd want to get yourself to maybe 500 to 600 strength, which should be fairly reasonable to do on a few div budget. And while you could possibly look for a little bit of intelligence to help with your mana regen, I don't really personally feel like it's worth it, given that intelligence basically doesn't do anything else for us. So as long as you follow the steps of 400 strength, then 200 to 300 dexterity or so, and then followed by as much strength as you possibly can from there, you should have a great time with this build. With that out of the way, let's go talk about what your gear is going to look like. Now, there's going to be two things I want to talk about here. One is going to be the trait filters and how to use them, and then two, the kind of stats you're going to look for on your gear, as well as the challenges you're going to be facing while gearing. If we want to go over the filters really quickly, there'll be a bunch of trade links in the description below. There'll also be in the mobile link as well, and these are going to basically help you find whatever you want to find. For example, if you want to look at chest plates, this filter is pretty easy to use. If you want to specifically only look at offers in Exalted Orbs, which I would recommend, as if you scroll down past 5 to 6 Exalted, you'll start seeing 1 div items show up, because currently the trade website values divines at around 6x. And because of that, all of these 1 div offers will show up, but then, hey, magically, 7x, 9x, 10x, and so on. So what you can do to fix that is to go down to the battle price and change it from relative to Exalted Orb, and suddenly all of those div offers will just be gone. It'll just be smooth all the way through. Outside of that, the other thing to mention is going to be how to potentially use this to find yourself better items. For example, if you want to find yourself a slightly better chest plate than the ones that are shown here for you, you can either just swap it to divines, and then it'll most likely show you substantially better chest plates, or you can change the filters, such as change the life from 150 to something like 170, and it'll show you slightly better chest plates. The other thing that I need to mention about all these filters is that all of them will have a sum. This sum is typically going to be based around the attributes on it. If you click on this, it will filter all the items to show you the ones with the highest sum at the top, meaning that out of everything that we can currently search for, this chestplate has the highest amount of total attributes on it. This is going to be very useful for you to be able to find exactly where you're looking for. So I do recommend to maybe take a little bit of a look at the filters and mess with them if your budget's a little bit higher than the items that are being shown in the filters. But if you don't want to touch any filters, as long as you click on the sum button to filter the best items to the top, and then find something that's affordable for you, that's all you really need to do. So with that said, let's talk about what the gearing is actually going to look like. Gearing for this build is going to be a two-step process. First, we need to get ourselves resistance cap, as that is highly crucial for not just immediately falling over and dying. And then after that, simply just stack as many attributes as possible. Now, to go about resistance, there's going to be two different ways you can go. One is going to be to get yourself more Invictus, which is a chestplate that has a big pool of mods they can choose from. And when the chestplate drops, it picks 2 mods in that pool and puts them on the item. And what we're specifically looking for here is a more Invictus that has the 10% increased elemental resistance per socketed soul core or rune on it. What we could then do is get ourselves this chestplate with the resistance roll on it, along with getting ourselves 4 soul cores of the Sidiculato. And then with this, we can effectively get 60 to all elemental resistances from a chestplate. The downside of this chestplate is that it's a little bit expensive at around 2 divines or so for an elemental resistance roll, but this is most likely going to be the chestplate that we're going to be building the mid game and the late game of this build around. So if you do have the budget for it, I would recommend to possibly go on and buy this first as your first piece of solving resistances. If not, what you're going to want to do is just get yourself a rare chestplate. Now, ideally, the way we're going to try to solve resistances is going to be through our chestplate, our belt, and our boots first. The reason we want to do this is because these 3 slots are fairly low value for a build, while on gloves, we can get added lightning damage, which makes them a little more valuable. And then ideally, we do not want to get a single resistance roll on our rings for suffixes, as we can get a lot of attributes on those items. The way attributes roll on gear is based off of their base. For example, if I get myself a pure energy shield chestplate, it can only roll intelligence on it. So if I want a chestplate that has both strength and dex on it, it has to be an armor evasion hybrid. Rings and amulets don't have this, meaning that they can roll int, dex, and strength all at the same time. Jewelry also even has the benefit of having the all attributes roll on it, which is highly coveted by our builds because it gives us all 3 attributes at the same time in a very large amount. So your goal here to use your body armor, your boots, and your belts to try and fix your res, use your gloves if needed, and then just have your jewelry be the most amounts of attributes possible. On your boots, all you're really looking for is a pair of boots with movement speed and with as many resistances as you can. And then on your belts, because the only attribute that can roll on belts is strength, you can easily get yourself a belt with a high strength roll and 2 very high resistances. You don't really care about getting a high life roll on your belts, which means you can get yourself a substantially higher res belt for cheaper, because most people are going to not value a belt without a high life roll on it as being worth much. But in our case, because of enhanced effectiveness giving us 4 life per strength, if we get ourselves a belt with 2 high res on it and 30 strength, that 30 strength is just worth 120 life. So we don't need a big life roll to begin with. But if we do manage to get one, then well, we could very easily have a belt that gives us upwards of 200 life on it very easily. From there, you're going to want to look for a pair of gloves afterwards. And ideally here, you're going to be looking for an added lightning damage roll, as any sort of added damage we can get in this build is an incredible scaler before we get Hand of Wisdom in action. And then you're going to look for any sort of dex and strength that you can on a hybrid base, along with any resistances that you might be missing, and a little bit of life. Now, you could potentially, if you're running Invictus Morris, because you're going to have so much res that you won't need res in all this gear, is potentially look for chaos res in all these items, and it'll be up to you to just include in a chaos res filter into any of these trade links, and you should very easily be able to find yourself some, as chaos res is going to feel really nice, and it would be a very nice to have in the build. Once you've done all that, and ideally you are res capped, it's time to move on to your rings and your amulets. Now, these are going to be very easy to search for because, again, we only really care about one thing. On rings, we could also get added lightning damage, so the filter will include that in here. But the only other thing that you're really worried about is clicking on the sum button and simply just searching for the rings and amulets that have the highest amount of attributes on them. You can very easily just go into the filters and set a maximum price on here, so you don't have to look at the rings that are worth several divs. It should be very simple for you to just find yourself a ring with high added lightning damage and as many attributes as possible. One thing you could do in the filter is potentially tick on the rarity or the life rolls as well to potentially find yourself a little bit of a better ring. But these are going to be kind of expensive, and you can possibly reduce the weighted sum to something like 30, for example, or change the other mods to find yourself some cheaper items. But rarity and life are nice to haves and not must haves on the ring. As long as you just find yourself a very high sum ring with a lot of attributes, you're good to go. The same is going to go for your amulet, as well, there's nothing else on the amulet that we really need other than as many attributes as possible. You can go out and possibly find yourself life on the amulet as well. And on the rings, you can possibly get yourself rings such as a topaz base, which would give you a little bit of lightning res for free if you still need a little bit of res. Finally, as I mentioned about rarity on rings, you can possibly look for rarity on your gloves and your boots as well, as rarity is unfortunately a necessary evil in this game, and it will massively increase the amount of loot that you get. So as you keep upgrading your gear, if you do feel like you want to buy yourself some better items than what you currently have, try to pretty much use the same trade links, but to tick on the rarity filter that is disabled to find yourself some gear with the same stats that you have, but with rarity on it as well. If you get yourself to about 100 rarity or so, you'll pretty drastically notice a big difference in the amount of loot that drops. Finally, the last thing to talk about are going to be jewels. Now, jewels in this build are going to be pretty straight to the point. We're simply going to want to get yourself a jewel with 2% life on kill and a jewel with 1 or 2% mana on kill, and that should completely take care of a decent chunk of your recovery while mapping and take care of the majority of your mana problems with the exception of bosses. On bosses, we're still going to unfortunately for now just have to use our mana flask and deal with it, but given we kill the bosses so quickly, it shouldn't be too much of a hassle to just use 1 or 2 swigs of a mana flask and the boss should be dead by that point. Now, there's a lot of different stats on jewels that are good for you to be able to get, and what you can potentially do is come over here, and if you want to look, for example, life on kill jewel, specifically uncheck the mana on kill, and then if you change this minimum on the count to say something like 3, you will specifically go and find yourself better jewels that have more useful stats on them. Now, as you can see, they might be a little bit restrictive, so ideally, checking it at a count of 2 might be a little bit easier to find yourself something decent. Or if even those are too expensive, you always set this down to count of 1 to find yourself a life on kill or mana on kill jewel with at least 1 other useful stat from this giant set of filters. And with all this, that should pretty much be everything you need to know to be able to get yourself some gear upgrades and to progress all the way up to tier 15 maps with no issue. And I would say if you put somewhere around maybe 50 exalted or so into your build, you should have a pretty comfy time. If you end up putting somewhere around 100 to 150 exalted, that should pretty much be all the gear they need to then be able to sit there and farm the 10 divs required for HoWA. Obviously, you're free to keep upgrading your build as much as you want until you feel like you're ready to upgrade to HoWA, but at some point you really should just start saving for HoWA as soon as you can as well. That basically makes the build become ridiculous. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below and I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask me any of your questions there. With all that, kitties, I hope you're enjoying the build as much as I am. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope you have happy holidays since it's being released around the holidays, and I'll see you all in the next video.